In these past few videos, I've been discussing the role of tradition and sort of the role that religious philosophy has to play in forming a coherent view of the world. But in modernity, it's often a difficult thing to do, whereby it often seems as if modernity and religion are in a clash or conflict, so to speak. It's very important then to take a more nuanced approach regarding the role that religion would have to play within a more modern society. It's quite impractical and perhaps even impossible to return to the kind of dogmatic view of the world that was perhaps held by people in the past. To be fair here, a lot of the priestly class or the scholarly class of past civilizations were not necessarily dogmatic in the way that we view dogmatism or how we understand dogmatism to operate. In many cases, these scholars, whether they be the medieval scholastical scholars of Christendom or the medieval scholars of the Islamic civilization or the Hindu sages of India, of ancient India, many of them engaged in the rational sciences, in philosophy, in logic. Certain groups amongst them freely encouraged rational inquiry and philosophical thinking in very fundamental aspects of their religious traditions. Oftentimes, there was a separation between the commoner who did not delve deeply into said issues and the priestly or scholarly class who had a full reign of resources and knowledge to deal with such issues and discuss them in a very academic and nuanced manner. However, it's quite obvious that in modern society, such a dogmatic approach perhaps would not be possible. Of course, there's the whole criticism of organized religion in certain Enlightenment circles and certain figures within the Enlightenment era, which was very much justified in its own way. One could also view a lot of the Protestant movements that arose in various religions, whether it be the traditional Protestant movement of Christianity, Salafism within the Islamic tradition, the Arya Samaj in the Hindu tradition. One can view these Protestant type traditions as a kind of natural counterbalance to the excesses of institutionalized religion. They sort of balanced out this kind of very institutionalized clerical kind of form of religion by advocating for going straight to the texts and going straight to the primary sources in and of themselves. Of course, the issue that then raises is that how do you understand that without certain hermeneutical and exegetical tools by which to interpret the primary scripture? The issue that arose with modernity and a lot of perhaps outright atheists or people who denied religion altogether or forms of organized religion is that modernity inevitably led to this kind of nihilism where nobody really believes in anything beyond the material world. That, of course, leads people to not stand for anything, but more importantly, it leads to a lack of belief in anything worth of value, even perhaps in humanity itself. And may I kindly suggest to the people, perhaps, who may view religion and philosophical thinking as a whole as very abstract and a barrier to rational human thinking and progress, that without certain fundamental religious concepts and certain fundamental principles which we hold dearly and hold them on a faith like basis almost, without these fundamental principles, we would live in a world which wouldn't be very tolerable at all for most people to live in. Certain values that we hold very dear to us are fundamentally those which stem from certain religious traditions. Ultimately, societies which don't have foundational, sort of epistemological and metaphysical principles to stand upon, they start to lose belief in themselves. And when societies begin to lose belief in themselves, that is when they ultimately collapse as a civilization entirely. So, whilst it was very much within the right of certain philosophers to critique the extremities of organized religion that were often very repressive to human liberty, it's also important to note that religion is an important aspect of many people's lives and one which I think will continue to sustain the lives of millions of people to come. It would then be very naive to just throw religion out entirely and simply condemn it as a backward institution to be abolished. As Marcus Aurelius rightly points out, that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. How many examples of there of civilizations in the past which began to become extremely decadent, extremely nihilistic, towards the end of their lifetimes, just fell into all kinds of insanity and vice, and that ultimately led to their downfall. And history has a way of may I be quite unironic here, dealing with civilizations that are either very corrupt and rotten to their core or have become extremely stagnant and decadent. We saw this in the Bronze Age collapse, we saw this in the collapse of the medieval world at the hands of the Mongols, we saw this at the collapse of the European hegemony at the end of World War One, and further reinforced at the end of World War Two. We increasingly see now that the Enlightenment project itself is under attack. The very important values of human liberty and the value of human life, which are held dear in the liberal project, are coming extremely under attack. We see this whether it be, for example, one very good example of this was the ultra nationalist movements that arose in the wake of the collapse of Yugoslavia, that led to these kinds of ultra nationalist movements that committed all sorts of war crimes and all sorts of atrocities. We also see how modernity can end up morphing off into something extremely worse in the form of the many authoritarian fascist or communist states that arose that committed unspeakable crimes against humanity. Ironically enough, the one thing that could probably save a lot of these ideals of human liberty and of the value of human life would fundamentally be a metaphysical worldview which could operationalize these values in their proper place and proper context. Hence, the hope is that we could reach a mature understanding and a kind of synthesis between both modern science, its importance, and the importance of basing our assumptions on a scientific worldview, but at the same time incorporating that within a deeper metaphysical and philosophical framework which we use to understand the world. And many of the values that we should take shouldn't necessarily be strictly religious per se, but many of them will inevitably be derived from religious values, as many people, in fact, most people, hold them very dear to themselves.